And we're going to focus on the heart of this passage about the bread of life that was just read to us in John 6, especially maybe focusing on verse 35. I'll just read John 6, verse 35 again. Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry, and he who believes in me will never be thirsty. But as I told you, you have seen me, and still you do not believe. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me, I will never drive away. I am the bread of life. Now, I'm not going to assume this morning that everybody here in church is a Christian, a believer, a follower of Jesus Christ. Probably the vast majority, yes, that would be the case. But it may be that we've grown up in Christian circles and we've reached, I don't know, our adolescent years, our teens or our 20s, and we're just not sure. Maybe we want to inherit the faith of parents or grandparents, but we're just not sure. So we want to check it out. Is it true? If we're going to commit ourselves to something, we want to know it's true. We want to know it's real, that it's not something that's manipulative or that's going to deceive us and ultimately let us down. And sometimes people will go for what is shocking, for what is extraordinary, for what is miraculous. And that may well satisfy them for a time. But the thing is, if we had been alive 2,000 years ago, if we had been able to visit the Holy Land and meet Jesus Christ in person when he was walking around on the earth, doing his signs, his miracles, his wonders, if we had seen him raise the dead, open the eyes of the blind, if we had seen his authority over nature, I'm not sure that it would advantage us all that much over the position that we're actually in this morning. Because we have the written account of who Jesus was, how he treated other people, how he related to God, how he related to evil forces, to the forces of truth and light, and the forces of darkness. We have that in the Bible. And the simple fact is that thousands of the people who met Jesus and saw him did not believe in him, turned away from him, actively resisted him. And you might be thinking, I'm at a disadvantage. I wish I could travel back in time and see Jesus and see if it's true. You don't need to travel back in time. What you need to convince your heart is still available to you today. The evidence that you need to make up your mind if Christianity is true and the basis for living, or if it's a lie and it's a waste of space, you can find that out just by getting to know what is written down about Jesus, particularly in a document like the Gospel of John. If you're here last Sunday, you'll know that over the summer, lots of our teaching, certainly on Sunday mornings and some Sunday evenings over the summer months, will be based on John's Gospel. So tonight we'll be hearing about major themes from John and why they should make us believe in Jesus. That's what Paul will be teaching on tonight. And particularly on Sunday mornings, we're going to explore these places in John's Gospel where Jesus says something with an iconic phrase, I am. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. I am the gate or the door to eternal life. Or as we have it here in John 6, verse 35, I am the bread of life. And each of these is a word picture. It unlocks something of the meaning of who Jesus is and what Christians believe about him. But that two-word phrase, I am, It's a hook back to God's revelation of himself through past ages, and especially when the people of Israel were formed and entered into a relationship with God. The record of that is in the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus, in the times of Moses, when God said, "This is my name, Yahweh, Jehovah, the God who exists and makes promises, the God who enters into relationships. And I am the God who doesn't change. I am, I was, I always shall be. I am is my name. Yahweh, Jehovah is my name, and I am the God who exists. I am." And Jesus comes along centuries later and he says, "I've come down from heaven to satisfy your thirst for God. I've come down from heaven to be the bread of life that keeps you alive spiritually, that feeds your hunger for truth, for reality, for meaning. I am the living bread." And anyone hearing that 2,000 years ago would have had to make a choice, either that Jesus was a crazy man or a blasphemer who was attacking everything logical, or he was unique. And he was indeed the way, the truth, the life. He was indeed the bread of life. People had to make a choice about Jesus 2,000 years ago. Some said yes to him, some said no to him then, and it's the same in the 21st century. Check it out. Is this true? Is this real? The issue in John's Gospel is always the truth claims of Jesus, and do I believe them? Is this credible? Can I build my life on this, or can I safely walk away from it? Can I meet my spiritual needs somewhere else, or is this the one source? I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. It's an astonishing claim. Jesus is saying in John 6, "Feed on me or you starve. Feed on me or you wither away. Feed on me or you die. Without me, life is impossible. Without me, knowing God is impossible. I am the bread you've got to eat." It's an astonishing claim. Let's explore it. I've got two main ideas today. The first is that Jesus reveals our empty hearts. We really are searching, needy people, longing for truth, for meaning, for reality. And Jesus exposes the people he met 2,000 years ago and those who read John's Gospel today. And he says, is there anything in there? Is there anything real, deep inside of you? And the other idea is that Jesus then goes on to feed that emptiness, to feed our aching hunger for truth and for God. So Jonathan began his reading at verse 25, where a crowd have pursued Jesus across this many-named lake, the Sea of Tiberias or the Lake of Galilee. You can imagine, if you think of the Israel in your mind's eye, up in the north, there is this small sea, this small lake. You could row across it in a few hours. It's not a large body of water, and the River Jordan came into it and flowed out of it. So there were areas where it was difficult to walk round the lake, but most people would use boats, and probably there was something akin to a taxi service as well to get from the major towns like Capernaum and Tiberias, to get around the place. And Jesus and his disciples had access to a boat, and having fed a crowd, the crowd who were so demanding of Jesus' time and energy, of his attention, Jesus is tired, his followers, his disciples are tired, and it gets to be late and it gets to night, and Jesus tells the 12 followers, "Leave me alone now. You get in the boat or in the boat and travel across the lake and go to Capernaum, where Jesus had really based himself and done most of his teaching and his ministry. You go there, I'll join you later." They have a hard night of it, because a storm comes up and they're terrified. They think they're going to drown in that storm. They've seen the power of Jesus feeding a crowd with 5 loaves and 2 fish, but then they're in terror through the night because of the storm. And Jesus comes to them on the waves. He walks in the sea because he travels supernaturally. He is no ordinary person, this Jesus. And they arrive then eventually in Capernaum, and Jesus goes to the synagogue to teach and to explain about himself to the people there. And it's at that point that the crowds who across the lake had been fed by him the day before clock the fact that he's gone, clock the fact that he's escaped in the night. They can't quite understand it. They ask when they meet him, Jesus, when did you get here? We saw the boat leaving without you, and now you're here. We've been looking for you. We want more of what we had yesterday. This is something we're going to tell the grandchildren about. I mean, yesterday was amazing. I mean, how did you do that thing with the loaves and the fish? I mean, that was amazing. If we were Australians, we would say, that was beaut. We'd love to see it again. A wee shout out to those who listen from Australia. It was beaut. But actually their interest in Jesus, although it took them across the lake, although they pursued him until they found him, although the crowds looked very interested in Jesus, they're actually not interested in what God is doing through Jesus. They're not interested in the message that led up to the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. They're not interested in where that sign, that miracle that is a sign, is pointing to. Because that sign is pointing to Jesus Christ himself as the way to be fed by God and the way to know God. And that crowd didn't want that sign. They didn't want that message. They didn't want that direction in their lives. So the crowds look interested, but actually their hearts are empty. And Jesus, out of love for them, out of kindness for them, begins by exposing that emptiness, by confronting it, and by being really very honest and confrontational with them. And so he says to them, for example, in verse 26, I tell you the truth, you are looking for me not because you saw miraculous signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Your bellies are full, and you want your bellies to be full again. And you want miracles because they're spectacular and they're newsworthy and there's something to talk about. But actually, you are materialists. You want to gain more bread and more fish. It's material stuff that you're interested in. It's not more of God that you want. It's not more of me and my teaching that you want. You want to gain stuff. Maybe entertainment. Maybe something to chat about. Maybe just the bread. But I've come onto the earth to show people God and his truth. And the God who transforms us from the inside out. And unless you want that, I can't help you. Now, will you confess, will you admit to God that inside you're empty and you don't even know how needy you are? Will you keep putting on a mask of respectability, or will you be honest with God? That's what's going on in this story. They want bread, more bread. Well, if you go along to Tesco's and you explore their bread offerings, they all have a sell-by date. Some of them don't even have a sell-by date because basically it's been baked fresh and it's used today and it'll be not very nice tomorrow. And the stuff they've filled with chemicals, well, that might last a few days before it really turns to sawdust and becomes really unpleasant or moldy. But bread is not something that you can pass on to your grandchildren. You don't say this loaf has been handed down through the family and it's an heirloom, because bread spoils. Bread goes off. It's what we call a perishable. And Jesus is saying, are you wanting God to just give you perishable things, things with a short sell-by date, or do you want things that last forever? Earlier in this service, we mentioned Murdo Murchison, who has this terrible struggle with a brain tumor that's devastated his health and caused him daily problems, having seizures and such like. Now, I'm sure we pray that God will spare Murdo and give him months, maybe even years. I'm sure we pray that God will heal Murdo. But God is God, and God is wise, and God is sovereign. And if God should add 50 years to that man's life and take away his pain and suffering, but not give him truth, not give him peace that lasts forever, not give him wisdom that lasts forever, not give him joy that lasts forever, God would have cheated that man. Because health is perishable. Healing in this life is temporary. Being pain-free, being free from mental or physical illness is wonderful, but it's temporary. And the gospel of Jesus Christ is not just interested in what is perishable, what is temporary, but in what is permanent. What will change us forever. Do we have a taste yet in our hearts for the blessings and the gifts of God that last not just a lifetime, but forever and forever and forever? The motives, the desires of the crowd were my next meal and my next experience. They were, putting it crudely, focused on the belly area. And we might focus on disposable, short-term, temporary relationships where we use people. We might focus on good times and good experiences, on getting things, on getting wealth, on getting fame, on getting likes on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. What do our hearts really, really want? Among the Jewish people, one of the things that really convinced them they were special and important was their ethnic origins and their past. They claimed Abraham as their great ancestor, Moses as their great prophet who formed them as a nation and gained their freedom from slavery in Egypt. We're Jews. We're the people of God. We're the people with the book, the Bible, the covenant, and a past. And they were trusting in all of these external and temporary, perishable things. Even when they refer to the manna from the Old Testament, from the book of Exodus, the story in chapter 16 of Exodus, where God put bread on the ground for 40 years for the Israelites. They didn't get the meaning of that 40-year-long miracle, daily miracle, where God said, you're grumbling against me, you're grumbling against Moses, you don't believe in God's love, you don't believe in God's care, you don't believe in God's wisdom, you don't believe in God's plan for your life. Well, I'll show you for 40 years that I'm God and that you should obey me and trust me. I'll send bread onto the ground every morning. All you will have to do is gather it. You won't have to bake it. You won't have to process it. You won't have to do anything with it. I will feed you for 40 years while you are wandering into the promised land. And the problem in the book of Exodus was the unbelief of the fathers of the Jewish people. So Exodus 16 says this, how long will you, and the you is plural, how long will you as a people refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? It's in that context that God gave manna to the ancient Israelites. And now the contemporary Israelites of Jesus' era, they're saying, now remember Moses, he gave bread for 40 years to a nation of millions. Now, it was wonderful you fed 5,000 yesterday, but we would like you to be our personal magician who feeds us every day in a bigger way than even Moses did. Come on, Jesus, if you do that for us, we will believe in you. How foolish. Now, I don't want to be too hard on the Jews of Jesus' era and their unbelief, because I have the same problem. I tend to hide the emptiness of my desires in my heart. I'm sure you do the same. Let me give you some more contemporary examples. Do you know the author Jack Higgins? I'm sure many of you do. Wrote a lot of action and adventure books. The film The Eagle Has Landed is based on one of his books. Actually, Jack Higgins is still alive. He's a tax exile. He's down in Jersey. We have a Jersey family here who are tax exiles in Dingwall. But it goes the other way. So this guy, he was born in Newcastle. He was brought up in Belfast. But he has made so much money from the 85 novels that he's had published in his long life that he's sold something like 150 million copies of his books, plus film rights and all the rest of it. He's worth $86 million, which in pounds is £65 million. I know that to be true because Wikipedia says it's true. So it must be true. I don't think he's short of a bob or two, Jack Higgins. He's in his late 80s now. He's had a good and a long life, raised a family, and such like. He was asked a few years ago, what he would like to have known as a boy growing up in poverty in Belfast. What would he have liked to have known as a boy that he now knows? And he gave a really sad answer. Jack Higgins said that when you get to the top, there's nothing there. When you get to the top, when you've got everything this world has to offer you, when you've got all the material stuff, when you've got the experiences, the wealth, the cars, the yachts, the clothes, the money in the bank, when you've got all of that, when you get fame and when you get recognition and you get to the top, there's nothing there. It doesn't actually satisfy. If your heart is empty, you can have all this world and it doesn't mean anything. When you get to the top, what will you find? I'm 49. I'm clinging to being 49 for a few more months. And I'm the same age as a guy called Boris Becker. Boris Becker, of course, was at one time world number one in tennis, slightly more sporty than I am. For 3 years, he was Novak Djokovic's coach. They fell out last year. Becker won many Grand Slams. He had quite an impressive career. Looking him up on the internet, I discovered that he had made 18 million euro in prize money, but he'd made a whole lot more besides in his career. But over the years of the late 80s, 90s, when he was at his peak, winning Wimbledon and such like, his life was in a terrible mess. He reached the top. What did he find at the top? Here's a quote from his biography. In the spring of 1987, I could no longer take the pressure. I started with sleeping pills, seemingly completely harmless. I lived for years with this stuff. At the end, I would wake up in the middle of the night because the effect lasted only 3 or 4 hours. I would then have to take 2 more pills, the double dose. At times, I could not even close my eyes without sleeping pills. In my worst phases, whiskey came into it too, as it strengthened the effect of the tablets. And this is the end of the quote. I'd won Wimbledon twice before. Once as the youngest player. I was rich. I had all the material possessions I needed. It's the old song of movie stars and pop stars who commit suicides. They have everything, and yet they are so unhappy. I had no inner peace. I was a puppet on a string. 10 days ago, he was declared bankrupt. by an English court. But in his biography, he declared himself spiritually bankrupt years ago. He's had children with a number of women. He's had all kinds of relationships. He's had fame. He's had wealth. He's had success. But he was never happy. He was never fulfilled. And he couldn't even go to bed and sleep at night because his heart, poor man, was empty. What about your heart? Is your heart empty? Or is it full? Without Jesus Christ, John 6 says, you are empty, and you're empty forever. So Jesus reveals our empty hearts. I'm the bread of life. If you're not feeding on me, you're living on empty. But the second thing in the passage is that Jesus feeds that emptiness. He takes away that emptiness. He satisfies where nothing else can. Jesus feeds our aching hunger. We all have an aching hunger for God. We all have a longing for that spiritual reality and love and meaning that we know we were made for, we were designed for. The crowds ask Jesus for the bread he's promising. And so he says in verse 35, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry. He who believes in me will never be thirsty. I will satisfy you. Verse 48, as he explains all of this, I am the bread of life. Your forefathers ate the manna from Moses in the desert, yet they died. Moses' manna didn't satisfy the ache for God. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which a man may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. Verse 51, this bread is my flesh, my body, which I will give for the life of the world. And that gives you the heart of John 6, this bread of life passage. It gives you the heart, too, of the meaning of faith and salvation. It gives you the heart of what we're going to do with bread and wine in a few minutes in communion. The heart of Christianity is that our aching hunger for God is only satisfied by relying on Jesus, by depending on Jesus. Why does Jesus talk about bread so much? Why does he compare himself to bread? If we lived in the world of 2,000 years ago, we would know that the most basic foodstuff, the most basic of staples in our diet would be bread. There would be bread with every meal. When nothing else was available, no fish, no meat, these would be luxuries, there was bread. Bread and oil. That's what would keep people going. And you could store the grains, and you could store the flour, and you could bring it out when times were tough. There would be bread, and maybe little cakes would be made on stones or in little ovens. There was bread. And it's essential. Because if you don't eat, you starve. If you don't eat, you die. And Jesus says, if you don't feed on the living bread that has come down from heaven, your aching hunger for God will never be satisfied. My flesh is food indeed, meat indeed. My blood, which I give for the world, is what will satisfy your hunger and your thirst for God. Everything else will refuse to satisfy that aching hunger. Everything merely human will let us down. It will fade. It will disappoint. That's one of the ways John's Gospel is structured. If you read John 2, for example, the sign of Jesus turning water into wine, the human wine runs out. The party ends. It always does. But Jesus says, well, I can turn even water into wine. Follow me. And the wine does not run out. Join my kingdom. And then God's banquet does not end flatly and with disappointment. Jesus speaks to a religious teacher in John 3, a man called Nicodemus. And Nicodemus knows his way around the Bible, and he knows the concepts and the truths. And yet, he doesn't know God. And so Jesus has to say to him, Nicodemus, you were born from your mother's belly, but you need to be born from above with the life of God in you as well. You must be born again, because mere human birth, the birth of flesh and blood, is not enough. You need spiritual life that's provided by God. You need to be born from above as well as just born. You need to be born twice. You need God to intervene, because what's merely human is not enough. So, you've got bread to eat, have you? Is that enough? Bread and parties? Maybe the odd cake thrown in? No, it's not enough. We need more to live for, more to satisfy us. And so Jesus is the living bread that we need. But how does that living bread get into us? How do we feed on Jesus? How does he come to satisfy us? And that's where faith comes in. Jesus keeps explaining that Christianity is a matter of trust, a matter of depending on God and on God's Son. The crowds ask in verse 28, what must we do to do the works God requires? What do we have to do then, Jesus, to be in the good books with God, to deal with our spiritual emptiness? And the answer is, you don't have to do anything. It's down to God's Son, Jesus, to do it. Jesus answers, verse 29, the work of God, the only thing God requires is this, to believe in the one he has sent, to commit yourself totally to rely on Jesus, to depend on Jesus, to trust in Jesus. Not to fill the ache in your heart with a car or a relationship or a career or a holiday or a job, because every holiday, even the best, comes to an end. And youth will eventually fade, and fitness will eventually fade, and even the wealth of Boris Becker will get you into the bankruptcy court eventually. But the living bread never goes stale. The living bread never stops filling you. The living bread, Jesus, never lets you down. I am the bread of life. He who believes in me will never be hungry. He who believes in me will never be thirsty, because as you take me into yourself, rely on me, I become real to you. You have eternal life. What on earth was Jesus talking about when he says, you've got to feed on me? Verse 51, I'm the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats this bread, he will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. The Jews, verse 52, began to argue sharply among themselves, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? What's he on about? Eat his flesh, drink his blood. What is he on about? It's not cannibalism, surely. No, it's not cannibalism. Even if we could physically eat the body of Jesus Christ, how could that possibly do us any good? But it is about being as close to Jesus as something you can touch. Well, I've got bread on the table in front of me here. We'll use it for communion this morning. And I can hold it. And I can smell it and taste it and eat it. There's a little salt in it. It's got give. There's a texture. You can squeeze it. You can tear it. You can mold it. You can break it. You know what bread is. It's real. And Jesus is saying, those who have faith in me, those who believe in me, I am as real to them as the bread they can hold and put in their mouth and ingest, and it becomes part of them. It feeds them. I have to be as real to you as that. And we don't just feed on Jesus when we go through a ritual like sharing in communion. We feed on Jesus whenever we listen to him and call on him and pray to him and read his word, the Bible. So not cannibalism, but the reality of knowing and relying on Jesus, who is real. Need to finish. The time is gone. Are we feeding on Jesus today? Will we feed on Jesus in the Lord's table because by faith we rely on him? Many years ago, C.S. Lewis married an American woman called Joy Davidman. She was a remarkable woman, an author herself, and she too had a struggle with cancer, and the story of their marriage and of her suffering and death and his reaction to that has spawned some of the greatest books that C.S. Lewis wrote. But Joy Davidman, she published one of her own books called Smoke on the Mountain, a meditation on the Ten Commandments. And when she came to the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. When Joy Davidman was thinking about that, she was a Jew who had come to faith in Jesus Christ. She thought, how can I put this commandment positively? The commandment is, you shall not bow down and worship other gods, false gods. Put God first. How can I put that commandment positively? And this is what she came up with. Thou shalt have me. What does Jesus say in the Bread of Life passage? And what indeed does the Lord's Supper say to us today? God wants us to have God and to feed our empty hearts with a relationship with God and to feed our aching hunger for truth with Jesus. Thou shalt have me. Oh, forgive us, O God, when we try to satisfy ourselves with things that do not last. And show us Jesus in his beauty and perfection and in his love, so that we will have him and satisfaction forevermore. Amen.